Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and salam sejahtera everybody. A warm welcome and thank you for being with us on this beautiful Saturday morning for this Wacana Warisan Series WWS lecture. My name is Fali Idris and I represent the Malay Heritage Foundation MHF. Today marks the fifth and final session of the WWS 2022. We would like to thank everyone for supporting the series since day one. And also not forgetting those joining us for the first time today. Welcome to WWS 2022. Please allow me to briefly explain what WWS is all about for the benefit of our friends tuning in for the first time. WWS is one of MHF's flagship programs. It comprises a series of webinars aimed to encourage the development of new approaches and alternatives towards the understanding of history, economics, politics, society, and culture. This year, we have 5 different speakers delivering the webinars. We had Dr. Nazri Bahrawi as our first guest speaker. Aside from Dr. Amin Farid, our invited speakers for today's session, we have also featured Dr. Rosalina Rawi, Dr. Norida Kamari, and Dr. Nuhanisa. Certainly an exciting lineup of WWS speakers this season. One interesting point to note is those who attend all 5 sessions will be issued a certificate of attendance. Please note that only participants who register via the Zoom link before the session will be eligible for this cert. WWS webinars will be delivered in either English or Malay, and the final WWS webinar this morning will be delivered in English. The webinar will be moderated by Ms. Liana Nashita Shukarman, a postgraduate from the Department of Malay Studies at the National University of Singapore, NUS. Her research interest includes developmental studies and the relationship between literature and society. A former dancer in traditional and contemporary Malay dance, Liana has a deep passion for Malay heritage, language, and culture. She was appointed Teman Warisan by MHF last year during Hari Warisan, also known as Cultural Heritage Appreciation Day. The topic for this morning will be recognizing Tarian Melayu's contribution to Singapura's socio-cultural history, Pre-Nationstate. Without further ado, let me now invite Ms. Liana to start the WWS session and introduce our guest speaker. Over to you, Liana.
Thank you, Fadli, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and salam sejahtera. Thank you for joining us in the 17th Wacana Warisan Series by Malay Heritage Foundation. We have a few attendees with us here in the Zoom. We have Dr. Hanisa and also Wan or Saudari Farhana. I'm pretty sure there are people watching from the Facebook Live as well. So welcome. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning where many may choose to have breakfast outside or have a walk, but here we are talking about serious matters. So thank you to all who are attending this morning. So in today's Wacana Warisan, we will be discussing Malay dance in Singapore. Malay dance is another art form that has been practiced in Singapore from since a long time and is still very much alive today, right? In schools, there are students from primary, secondary, and tertiary education who choose Malay dance as their co-curricular activity or CCA. This October and November also, there are many dance festivals, showcase, and productions that are and will be presented by different Malay dance groups in Singapore. Seen from this point, then, Malay dance is a significant element or aspect of Malay culture and heritage. However, how do we appreciate it more than just an art form? How do we understand it deeper than just from its aesthetics and performative point of view? This is where discursive platforms like this is important for us to learn more, discover or rediscover more about our culture and heritage. With us here today is Dr. Noramin Farid, who is a choreographer, arts educator, and maritime Southeast Asian performing arts researcher. He's a recipient of the 2017 Singapore Youth Award and the 2018 India ASEAN Youth Awards. Dr. Noramin has also curated an online portal called Arki-Gen, which documents maritime Southeast Asian dance forms. He is also the president of a dance organization, DIAN Dancers, and the founding member of Arki-Gen, a group focused on promoting discourse, and research about Southeast Asian performing arts. So today, Dr. Noramin will be presenting the topic titled Recognizing Tarian Melayu's Recognizing Tarian Melayu in Singapore's sociocultural history pre-Nationstate. Dr. Amin, please.
Hello everyone, terima kasih. Okay, allow me to share my screen. Inshallah this works. Okay, it's taking some time. But okay, as we wait for the slides to miraculously appear, I am exactly what Liana has mentioned, and also, you know, though I must also say that I'm no longer a youth, right? So I'm 36 this year, and that would mean that I'm no longer a youth, but it's okay. I'm still working towards, constantly trying to highlight the importance of research on the performing arts in Maritime Southeast Asia, regardless of my age. Okay, so I just wanted to check, are you guys able to see the screen? Okay, and you can see me, my bobbing head. Okay, right. Before I continue, allow me to also address everyone in our national language, our bahasa Ibunda, because I'm also duta bahasa. Ni saya ingin also, sorry, saya ingin kongsi bahawa niat saya untuk memberikan ceramah ini dalam bahasa Inggeris adalah kerana saya akui bahawa ada banyak lagi yang harus saya fahami, lagi-lagi tentang istilah-istilah atau penterjemahan dari Inggeris kepada bahasa Melayu, dan juga saya tidak ingin meremehkan kerja para teman-teman seperjuangan yang telah banyak menyumbang kepada pembangkitan dan pembangunan bahasa Melayu, dan itu saya rasa ini adalah peluang yang terbaik untuk saya memperbaiki lagi atau mendalami cara-cara untuk memberi ceramah dalam bahasa Melayu, dan juga mengambil masa untuk menterjemahkan beberapa istilah dari Inggeris ke bahasa Melayu, dan kerana itu untuk masa ini izinkanlah saya memberikan ceramah saya dalam bahasa Inggeris dahulu. InsyaAllah pada masa yang akan datang nanti saya akan lebih berani dan gigih memberikan ceramah saya ini dalam bahasa Melayu. Okay. So that's my way of also trying to say that, it's very important to be effectively bilingual. Right. So this is my research. Actually, this is also part of my PhD research. This is chapter 1 of my PhD that I am revisiting, because this is the first time, to be honest, that I am sharing much of the archival materials that I've been working with. This is also because I think and some of you may know also that within the Malay dance community, I am the first within my community of practice to produce a PhD manuscript of Malay dance in Singapore. And a lot of times it's always also trying to share, parts of my research in a more accessible manner. So a lot of times I have done away with some of the theoretical parts or the archival materials that can be very daunting and requires a lot of theory and academic jargon, right? So this is actually my first attempt to do so. Prior to this, it's always been about sharing about Malay dance in a more accessible manner. So I apologize if the sharing today might be a little daunting for some, but I think this is also a very necessary step for us to show how Malay dance is in fact not only an aesthetic form, but a form that can also contribute to intellectual and to intellectual scholarship. Okay, so why the need for this? So growing up within the scene, I've been in the Malay dance scene for about 20 years. It's always learning about Malay dance history, looking at 1965 as year zero. So meaning to say that, it is this miracle that Malay dance existed only with the nation state, right? As all of us know, 1965 is the year when we gained independence. And of course, a lot of this 1965 onwards history acknowledges the history of persatuan-persatuan such as Triwana and Perkumpulan Seni as the beginning of Malay dance in Singapore. Though this is very much appreciated and acknowledged, we must also recognize that Malay dance has existed pre-nation state. And it's also to acknowledge that Singapore, prior to it being a nation state, was already a thriving space for the performing arts, be it colonial capitalism, be it activism. There were evidences of it, and it was necessary. And I think personally that this is the best time to acknowledge that Malay dance has something more to offer than just a product of nation building. And of course, though there is some recognition of the Bangsawan films and urban entertainment parks that existed prior to 1965, these were usually just done in a cursory gesture, meaning to say, oh yeah, we got it from them, but this is Malay dance Singapura, right? So it's necessary that we relook at some of this, and this is what I'm going to share today. So before I do that, let me just share briefly about what we already know, right? So Malay dance in particular was very much part of the nation building agenda. Malay dance were Malay dancers trained in Malay dance were recruited into the People's Association of People's Association Cultural Troops in 1965, and the National Dance Company in 1970. So these two entities itself provides a difference, right, between community dances. A lot of times it is the dances, the community dances that were featured as the Aneka Ragam Rakyat, right, of the late 50s, where it was part of the Malayan nationalism in trying to encourage a unity of the various races, right, and also art dances. So what is art dances here? Art dances would mean dances that were performed on proscenium stages, and it's usually regarded as an high art, right? So this is interesting because this is a transition from Malay dance as a folk dance into an art dance, which requires a different skill set, different acknowledgement of space, right? Because if it's a folk dance, it's a social form. It's a form that could be seen in kampongs or in open areas. But once it becomes an art dance, it is placed in a theater setting. Yeah. The 1972 Adelaide Arts Festival is always recognized as the pinnacle of what is now Singapore Malay dance. So this for this 1972 Australian International Festival, the National Dance Company was invited, and the Malay dance contingent showcased 5 Malay dances of the music dance genres of Asli, Inang, Masri, Joget, Zapin. And these dances eventually became what is now known as the Malay dance basics, or the Malay dance foundational dances. I'm sorry if you hear cats, right? My cats are running around. They're very excited to be also listening to my lecture with all of you. Now, so I see this acknowledgement of more states or institutional history to be part of what, in my thesis, is known as the model Malay minority dance system. So this is a way to also acknowledge that, progressively, Malays in Singapore, being a minority group and also being Muslim, had to deal with a lot of nation state building agendas, and also very much dealing with how we have to work out the stereotypes that continue to live about Malay people, right? So this is something that is, if we were to draw upon the work of looking at the myth of the lazy native, the stereotype of the lazy Malay person calls for a modern Malay minority that is hardworking, that is showcasing the best of his culture, his or her culture, obedience, etc. So this is a term that I've coined to acknowledge that the Malay dancer has to play that role, because we were a representation of Malay peoples when it comes to portraying our culture to international audiences, and that the Malay dance in itself was a key agent or a key practice of nation building and multiculturalism. So this is just me giving you a brief view of what we already know as history of Malay dance. Now, what are the implications of acknowledging just a state or an institutional understanding? Now, we risk losing and not knowing the nuances and colors of cultural life, right? We must also acknowledge that dance was an organic activity and not used merely in socio-cultural engineering that we are seeing today. We must also acknowledge the contentions about dance and performing arts in certain circles, which we can regard as parallels to what we ourselves are experiencing today. So we must also acknowledge that today itself, people are still questioning whether Malay dance is halal or haram. We are also looking at it as being taboo. We still acknowledge that a particular historical figure is seen as prostitutes. So these are things which I'm going to highlight later as we go about talking more about Malay dance history pre-1965. So a lot of the work that I do deals with working with archival materials from the late colonial period. Now, why do I work with the late colonial period itself? Is because we see visual representations of Malay dance, be it in the forms of postcards, and we will also see book manuals. Also at the same time, newspaper articles were highlighting Malay dance, but not as a form, but actually as a hindrance and as a nuisance, right? So this is quite interesting for us to look at. Also, at the same time, as you're going to listen to me speak, you realize that I don't really look at Malay dance, the form itself, but look at the ecosystem that helps to make us understand what Malay dance is. So it's not always about the dance. It's also very much it's not about the dance, but it's very much about and what goes around and about the dance. Okay, to give you an understanding of the life and cultural period. So when I looked at the archive, which looks at colonial ordinances, encyclopedia, postcards, newspaper articles, there were certain issues that I had to deal with. Firstly, I have to take note of my own role and positionality in engaging with these archives. Who am I in this contemporary period looking at this? My gender also is something that I need to be critical of. My 21st century sensibility is also something that I need to acknowledge as well. Also, at the same time, as we are looking at this, we are also realizing that the way we understand dance today is very much an extension of the colonial understanding of dance. Yeah. And there are the lack of materials that look at dance directly. So something I was talking about just now. And also to acknowledge the inadequacy of methodologies to engage deeply with these materials, to help imagine socio-cultural circumstances. Now, I'm only saying this because a lot of times when we look at archives, we are just looking at it. We are describing what we see, very much like our primary school oral examination, right? We look at a picture and we describe it. But there's something more to it, especially if the researcher is a dancer. So this is when I also have to engage my embodied knowledge as a dancer, engaging with such archives. Now, I'm highlighting critical dance studies here because this is actually the discipline that has provided me a lot of insights to work with, right? It is actually an inclusive space, very much a way for scholars of color. When we say US scholars of color, we're also talking very much about scholars who are Black, of Latinx, who are forging the path to provide a very nuanced understanding of dance history, of cultural history, partly because we know that a lot of our histories were written by the white person, the white man or the white woman. So it was necessary that they had to engage deeply with critical race theories and anti-racist practice. Now, this for me was important because of what I mentioned earlier, that Malay dance is in fact a very racial representation. And our position as indigenous but yet minority is a political position that we need to acknowledge. And that is also something that is manifested in the way we portray Malay dance today. Now, the next point, dance is culture, dance is political. This is also a way to, like what Liana also said, to talk seriously about dance. Dance is not merely a product of aesthetics, okay, though that's also important. We must regard dance capacity as culture, as politics, as social, right? So this is a way to move away from mere representation, entertainment, to acknowledge cultural action and process. And lastly, we want to look at methodologies, right? Like what I've mentioned earlier, looking at archives is not merely just looking, right? And especially for myself as a dancer with 20 years of experience, I also need to acknowledge that my training as a dancer is both knowledge and method, okay? And when we engage with visual materials, because of our training as dancers, there is a need to acknowledge the embodied and the sensorial, right? Because it's more than just looking. So this is when I say decentering ocular centrism. So ocular centrism here is the privileging of the visual, of the sight, okay, over other senses or other capacities, because we actually have many other ways to engage. Right. So now we will go into already an interesting point working with the archives, right? Is the colonial misconceptions. Now, I start with a complaint here. And of course, I've given you if you're looking at the screen on the left, where this is actually one of the earliest in colonial newspapers that Malay dance was actually mentioned. But it's not necessarily just about Malay dance, okay? So I have highlighted here, I will read it for you. The complaint goes, "Sir, the inhabitants of the neighboring of Kampong Baru are being treated on moonlight nights to Malay dance music on the premises of a prominent Malay thereabout until 2 in the morning. The principal feature in the discordant orchestra is a big drum beaten in the most objectionable, meaningless manner, the only thing aimed at being apparently to produce as big a row as possible. Could we look to the guardians of our public safety to have this music stopped in future at least at 12 p.m., by preference at 11 p.m., and if possible, to do away with the drum altogether?" So of course, when we read this is of course written by a resident. Okay, a resident, when we talk about the colonial period, is of course a European or a British colonial person, colonialist who's present and cannot stand the sound of our Malay drums, right? And this is interesting because it provides us insights to the fact that Malay dance and music was actually being practiced all the way to the early morning, right? This is, of course, today, in our present circumstances, is not something that we can do now, right? Because we have actually acknowledged a very different understanding of our days and our nights. So this is something that I will highlight a little further later. Now, the issue with a lot of this complaints, right, that sees Malay dance music as problematic or as a nuisance is also featured in many other complaints that were published. Okay, so for example, as you can, if you can read that the higher part, not this one, but the other one, that side. And I read, but we think that if His Excellency had devoted a little of his time and attention towards the suppression of the fearful records which the Orientals of various races and creeds kick up at various times and places, he would have been doing the state some service for which he would have received the blessing of every peaceably disposed householder in this settlement. If the tom-toms and the flabby drums were to stop at a reasonable hour, say 12 o'clock, there would not be much harm done. But when the hullabaloo is kept up from sunset to close upon sunrise, it becomes monotonous to the average European whose sleep it is murdering. Right? So we can hear how the colonialists were actually speaking about the entertainment or the performing arts of Malay performing arts during that time, that they found us to be very disruptive, right? Actually, this disruption to colonial Singapore at that period actually prompted the municipal government to start a status ordinance. So what a status ordinance is like rules and regulation on how and when you could perform. So that means rules and regulations were put on every form of performing arts, every form of theatrical arts, which is very general, and also includes ronggeng, wayang, mendu, bangsawan, etc. Right? So that means they would need to seek license from the police before they can have any sort of entertainment. Okay, so this is only a few complaints, but there were many others. Interestingly, if we were to go deeper, there were some misunderstandings or misidentification of sounds. For example, there was a complaint about Malay drums, but in fact, it was actually the Chinese opera drums. So a lot of colonial, sometimes I call it a colonial myopia that's visual, and also probably or probably there's issues also with their oral, with their ears, because they were not able to identify the community or the form that was making the din and noise at a period of time. So this is very exciting. This was happening in the late 1800s, going into the 1900s, where theatre ordinances became quite a hindrance to our bangsawan, to wayang. Wayang here could be not only wayang Chinese wayang, but also wayang kulit, etc. So wayang is a very generic term used at the period. So this is very much telling of the sonic environment of colonial Singapore. Sonic here means the sounds, right? And a lot of times, and this is also drawn from the work of Jennifer McCullum, that acknowledge that for a lot of Malay communities, the ramai, or what we can translate as the busy noisiness, is a positive description of sound and its close relation to social life, right? Because the ramai actually showed economic success and political power, an increase in population where many people were boisterous and talking was a way to show that, there is strength and power in that, right? The strength in ramai, keramaian orang, as opposed to quiet, regarded as solitude and susceptible to the natural and the spirit world. Now, this ramai is actually also very much practiced today, as if we acknowledge the kompang as a way to bring the ramai, to bring the people together, that there is an acknowledgement. Of course, we have had people complaining about our kompangs, but that is also a way of pride to bring in our Raja dan Permaisuri Raja Sehari. Okay. Now, another one is the emergence of time thrift. Now, what is this? Now, this is also acknowledging that the reason why the colonialists were very unhappy with the sounds and the performing arts of the period was because of an evolution of Western colonial time as a result of industrial capitalism, right? So the acknowledgement that time is profit, and they were drilled since young to improve each shining hour. This is actually a work done by E.P. Thompson, she's a historian, to acknowledge that the West, or the Europeans, were already trying to segregate their time, to acknowledge that they need time to rest from 12, you keep hearing 12 p.m., right? 12 p.m. onwards, so that they can wake up in the morning to do work, to be industrious, right? But for a lot of Asiatic, I'm using this old colonial term, Asiatic populace, it wasn't very much about day and night. Because for a lot of Malay performing arts, we start after Isyak, for example, after, membaca Al-Quran, berzanji, etc. And then we will go all the way to the early morning. Right? And it's very common to actually hear from oral history recordings when village headsmen would also say that, sometimes entertainment can go for many, many days. Day and night, you don't recognize day and night, you keep entertaining all the way, because that our understanding of time was very different. Now, of course, the Cater Ordinance created a lot of unhappiness, and some of our members who were very close, the members of the Legislative Council, though they were colonialists, were very understanding that it doesn't make sense for Malay people, or why Malay people? Because we live in villages, probably the outskirts of the urban setting, to travel far just to seek a license for us to do the rongging in our house, atau to get entertainment for weddings, right? So they actually spoke up on our behalf, and here we can see J.B. Vermont, and I quote him: "To expect every Malay village wayang to be licensed was contracting far too much the amusements of the people." So this is like very condescendingly looking at the Cater Ordinance that was calling for a very unnecessary regulation. Yeah. Okay. Another part of my research also deals with looking at colonial misidentifications. Okay. Right. So here you are actually looking at a postcard. If you look at the the far yes, on the left of your screen, you would notice that this is a postcard that says Javanese Dancing Girls Singapore. Now, I am very thankful that my training as a maritime Southeast Asian dancer can acknowledge that this is not Javanese dance. Okay, the contortion of the bodies are very different. The costumes are very different. And one thing's for sure, for a lot of Javanese dancing, you don't have this many girls dancing at the same time. The idea of mass dancing is a colonial or a Western construct that is replicated today in Indonesia. But during that period, there was a selected number, okay? And this is not Javanese dance. Also, at the same time, we were to look at the circle drum or the circle frame of the musician. This is, of course, also not a typical instrument in the gamelan ensemble, for example, right? So this is itself actually, if we were to look at this picture here, it's actually a Burmese form called the yin, yeah. And this was a misconception, misidentification, and also at the same time quite telling of the colonial fascination or fetishization of Java, right? If we actually were to read the story of Raffles, he was very fascinated by Java. And this was also probably something that was appreciated by the colonialists at that period, who were very quick to look at a particular form and say that it's a Javanese dance without actually looking looking at the details of it, right? So I provide here a very modern, contemporary photo of the Yin Burmese dancers, right? Just to acknowledge the misidentification. Now, another part of my research also deals with looking at this visual images, okay? First, to acknowledge where it was published. Now, this was a visual image that was published in 1923, the one here, right? In an encyclopedia called People of All Nations. And here, and I'll read for you, there is a title, Stately Measured Movements of Malay Dance. And then it reads, to the stranger, the dance must appear decidedly monotonous, a constant repetition of the same gestures and movements. But the Malays appreciate these efforts on the part of their fellow countrymen, and the hearty applause from the spectators is echoed and emphasized immediately by the tom-tom players who yell their cries of approval while beating a deafening tattoo on their hollow drums. Now, here we hear the word tom-tom again. I'm really not sure where they get the word tom-tom. I'm also trying to figure out probably that is the way to describe drums, but by the colonialists from the very beginning, because they don't know how to say rebana, they might not know how to say the name of our different kinds of drums. But what we can appreciate from this writing itself is to acknowledge that a lot of Malay dance forms were in fact a constant repetition of the same gestures, right? Of a particular period. Of course, nowadays, if you were to look at Singapore, Malay dance in Singapore, there's a lot of things, right? We have evolved. But during that period, it was very much, the santai, or the movements that were very simple, not too much, because it was a social setting. Okay, of course, this picture was replicated or reproduced, republished as postcards in 1933 here. Oh, I can actually move to 1933, where you see the same visual image, right, being reprinted, and it's seen here as Malay Dancers Singapore. To be honest, is it really Singapore? This is also another issue that I had to tackle in my thesis, because the postcards were easily shown as Singapore because it was a tourist postcard, and a lot of European colonialists who were traveling via ship, via steamship later on, because of the opening of the Suez Canal, would come to Singapore as a port of call, and these postcards were made available for them. So it's just easier to just call Malay Dancers Singapore. So at the same time, it's also to acknowledge at the period of time as well that Singapore was a thriving port of call, a port city that could have been seen as a representation of the Malay world altogether. Okay, there is a description, right? Now, what we see here is 2 dancers and 3 musicians, right? Okay. So for a non-dancer, this is just that, right? But for a dancer such as myself, then I am made to question, if I was to replicate such movements, what can I say about the dance? Now, as a dancer, I am able to determine to some extent, right? And of course, we cannot know the authenticity of it, but we can also acknowledge that this is actually a Zapin dance. Why is it not joget? Why is it not asli or an inam, right? First, we need to acknowledge that these are 2 men dancing together, and a lot of Zapin dances were between men. Okay. Number 2, we also acknowledge that there were musical instruments at the back, and one of it is the rebana. And a lot of times in Zapin setting, young boys would look on to their elders as they are dancing, because this is a way of transmission, right? Back then, there was no manual books. It was all listening in, watching, observing, participating. So this is Zapin. What other parts can I acknowledge to recognize this? Of course, it's also to recognize that even between these 2 men, from the way that their stances are, there is also a degree of expertise, right? The older man yang memakai haji itu, is somebody who is a veteran, who has done this for many years. You can see him, and the way he is bending his body, that he is very much engrossed in the form. Whereas this other younger person, which is on your right of the screen, he is actually wearing a safari jacket or a colonial jacket, together with his kain pelikat. And if you to look at his shoes, Okay, it's also a very Western shoe. So this was also a person who probably, dealing with the current circumstance might not be very engrossed as his elder partner. Okay, so this kind of acknowledgement or this kind of description could come because of my background as a dancer. And I'm very thankful that this close reading allowed for us to understand this better. Okay. Now, a lot of what I've provided were actually very colonial materials. But in actual fact, we also have materials that were written about dance by our own people. But this in itself was actually a cautionary tale, or at least I'm not sure whether it's a satirical cartoon, but it does feel like it was something that the author was also trying to warn the community. So this was in, okay, so just let me share that this particular cartoon was found quite serendipitously in the British Library when I was sitting after 5 hours and it just appeared, right? Because not everything is digitized. I have to look slowly. So this was actually from my hard work, and I would like, to please acknowledge that editor. And this was 10 December 1934. And this was really interesting for me. It was like a eureka moment because it was acknowledgement that even in 1930s, there were early concern about Malay dance or dancing by the community. It's interesting. Why? Because it shows parallels to what we are going through here today. So let me just go through the cartoons. Actually, if you could read, it's from the top to the bottom, and it's written in Jawi. So it's written here, zaman aku dahulu, beginilah orang-orang muda yang andalan. During my era back then, this is how talented youths were. You could see that there were no touching, dressed in proper Malay costume. This, of course, we know is the ronggeng because it's between a man and a woman, dressed in the kebaya, dressed in proper wear that were done in village setting. Okay. And then second, tetapi zaman ini beginilah pula perubahannya. However, in this era, this is a change. And this was in the 1930s, mind you, that there were already this depiction of women in what we can see addressed with high slit, and also men in suits, right? A friend of mine was saying that it looks like a sailor suit, but we don't know for sure. But there is, of course, a difference between the first image to the second image, and this, of course, you can see there was really touching, very much in the tradition of the Latin craze dances, right? Of waltz, etc. Dan ketiga pula, we can see here, dan barangkali pada sedikit tahun lagi beginilah akan jadi. And maybe in a few years' time, this is how it would be, right? So this is actually an indication of what is happening in that period. What is happening during that period? You are actually seeing, of course, the proliferation of films that were coming from elsewhere. You are also actually the start. It was already 10 years in after the urban entertainment parks were started. Right, the very earliest urban entertainment parks was started in 1923. Yeah, okay. So this was also a cautionary tale of what's going to happen to the community. Now, mindful of time, now it's 11:44. I'm not sure how excited you are, but I'm so excited sharing with you. I have a few more slides. I hope we can get through this. Okay, now, in 1922 as well, there was the Malaya Borneo exhibition, right? And this is, of course, the official guide that was given. And you can see a man dressed in a sirat. Okay, sirat here is a iban wear, or men would wear chawat lah, basically, right? So the Malaya Borneo exhibition is a precursor of urban entertainment park Taman Hiburan. Because the New World started later in 1923, Great World in 1931, and Happy World. Of course, the reason why I keep bringing up the Taman Hiburan is because you will notice later that Malay dancers were co-opted into these sites, in these spaces. So the Malaya Borneo exhibition is not an exhibition like today you go to an exhibition, to go to a museum where you see things, pasted on walls, etc. So that is also important today. But back then, there were human zoos, right? So human zoos here is like basically recreating the setting of a particular group of people, and they were to show their daily life. And then you would see colonialists walking, judging, saying that, these are the splendids of my empire, gitu, right? So this was present then. Also, for these kind of events, when you want to show the might of the empire, you also want to show a variety and diversity. So, according to the Malay Borneo article in 1922, that it was trying to bring in all the different entertainment forms of the Malay world. So you have the Hadra, the Boria from Penang, Mak Yong and Menora from Kelantan, Mek Mulong, Wayang Kulit and Gamelan from Kedah, Sulu dancers from British North Borneo, and the Bangsawan presented jointly by a few local groups. And in addition to this, also during that time, there were already popular Ronggeng girls. So Ronggeng girls at that period, they would have their name called Miss. For example, if Liana is the Ronggeng girl, it's Miss Liana, right? But sometimes they would have a very English name, so Miss Lily or something like that, right? So this was very common. And they would be invited to also be part of the festivities to dance with some of the colonial masters as well. Okay. And during this 1922 in particular, I just wanted to share that the more exotic, right, were given the highlights. In particular, were the Dayak and the Murut people of Borneo. That, of course, today the Dayak and the Murut people live in Sarawak. No, not only Sarawak, but other parts of Borneo, but mostly they're represented in Sarawak. And it's interesting when I read some of these articles, you also hear this very interesting moment, because the Dayaks were not wearing Western clothes. They were still back in their normal sirat, just the chawat or the loincloth, right? And bare-bodied with their feathered garments, etc. So you hear here, they gathered the attention of locals at John Little, right, a modern shopping outlet where they visited. Together with their guide, the Dayaks were clad in their picturesque native dress, and the chief had on his feathered headdress and leopard skins and went around with his calm native dignity, entering John Little with his tribesmen, because he, the chief, had wanted to buy a gun and also some presents for the people in Borneo. This is a very interesting circumstance, right? Because in urban Singapore, you were seeing a man just clad in his sirat, walking around very unapologetically. I thought that it was a very interesting moment to highlight here with all of you. Okay, I just want to highlight about the Ronggeng girls. So this is actually part of the activism that I do personally as a scholar, but also together with a group of my colleagues called Arki-Gen, where we also are trying to revive Ronggeng. Right now, this is of course a photo of the Ronggeng girls in the urban entertainment parks. This is the common thing that you will see, where these ladies will be seated in rattan chairs, where they will be approached by men with tickets and they will be dancing with them, etc. But the tradition of Ronggeng or Joget, whatever it might be, were already present in the village setting. Right? So part of my research also deals with listening to oral history, recordings, and some of the village headsmen themselves knew that this was a very important entertainment for their people, right? So there were examples where the village headsmen of a particular island, we were talking about an offshore island, right? The name of the island escapes me at this moment. Knowing that it's a small island, but the coming of the Ronggeng troop was actually news to many other islands around. So what happened is a lot of times they have to create a very sophisticated schedule, right? So that everyone can have a go at the Ronggeng. So what happens is village headsmen have to divide, for example, their days. So normally Ronggeng troops will be around for 2 to 3 weeks up to a month. And village tradesmen have to segregate the times for different island people who are coming to this particular big island. So for example, today is island A, right? Only island A people. Then tomorrow is island B. So what does this tell us? This tells us that there was some importance of Ronggeng to a community, to a point where there is the sense of labor, a sense of need to plan, and that it wasn't something that they can just do without much thought, right? So the planning, the management of it offers us an understanding of how the performing arts in itself was an activity that is not only just entertainment. Now, in 1960s, the coming of the Malayan nationalism. Now, I couldn't write it down. It's actually Malay and AN in parentheses, because there were differing views of how Malaya should be. And this Malayan nationalism actually, there were many factions to it. There were, of course, people who believe in a multicultural Malaya. There were, of course, people who believe in Malay supremacy. And of course, there were who wanted a more in an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there were many factions to what Malayan nationalism could be. But interestingly, and this is my view, that what became very prominent is how these differing factions wanted to police the bodies of women. And this also, in a way, I call the death of the Ronggeng girl, because the policing of Ronggeng girls called for at the very basic, trying to say that they were prostitutes, to say that they were people who were putting our culture to shame because they are dancing not only with Malay men but men of different races. Because if you think about the urban entertainment park, it was a multicultural cosmopolitan site. So there were many people who are coming from different races dancing with the Ronggeng girls. Okay, so that taboo continues to live on, to be honest, even till today. Now, what people don't know, or people refuse to understand, was that the Ronggeng girls themselves were career women at that period of time. They were women who were divorcees, or sometimes some of their husbands have left them. They were single mothers who had to fend for big families. And the Ronggeng wage was actually one of the best for women at that period of time. And some of them they felt that this was the best way to go about doing it. Of course, there were very, very fortunate Ronggeng girls who eventually moved on to become actresses, singers, in films, etc., where they are not seen very much like how their friends who did not get to go into film were seen, right? But interestingly, a lot of the actresses that we put on the pedestal, actresses of the golden the era of golden cinema were and did start off as Ronggeng girls, right? One of them is, of course, Hapsa Buang, who was a choreographer. She was also an actress. I don't have a photo here, but if you were to look at her, you see her very frequently in many of the Malay films. She started off as a Ronggeng girl too. And interestingly, in her oral history recording, you would hear how she actually had to teach Shanghainese to cabaret girls. Okay, so you must try to understand the urban entertainment parks as a racialized space where there is, of course, the joget halls, okay, which actually is frequented by people of all races. But also there is the cabaret, which is, of course, a more raunchier, a more, a site where hostesses were able to touch, as in patrons were able to touch hostesses, etc. But these hostesses, who were mostly Shanghainese dance hostesses, had to learn Ronggeng as well, because some of the patrons want to Ronggeng with them in the cabarets. So they had to work and learn from the Ronggeng girls themselves. So there were a lot of exchanges that were happening, exchange of exchange of not only techniques, dances. They were also sharing with each other how the differences in costume or in fashion. So there was actually a time where Ronggeng girls were so inspired by the Shanghai Knit posters that they actually wear their batik sarongs with slits in the side because they felt that it was fancy. So this was very common, this exchange between the women entertainers, which was very intriguing. Okay, so the policing of women also called for the death of the Ronggeng girl, and of course, then allowing for Ronggeng to be more of a co-ed, co-ed entertainment, co-ed activity, right? So you have co-ed meaning both genders, learning and doing it together. So of course you have this 1961 book, Pengolahan Muzik dan Tari Melayu, that was disusun by a literati, Muhammad Zain Haji Hamzah. And also another book, 1965, looking at the cara menari ronggeng dan mainang. So if we were to look at some of the things here, right, the left of your screen would feature some of the floor patterns that you can do with your partner. Okay, so this one is also trying to say that the mastery of the Ronggeng girl now is given to you. So now Liana and Fadli can do Ronggeng by just looking at the manuals, for example. Okay, then the other book called Cara Menari Inang dan Joget, Inang dan Ronggeng. This is also how the manuals look like, right? You actually have like ballroom icons going up from below to up, teaching you how to dance in the way that you should. Okay, and of course offering advice such as gerak langkah bagi penari perempuan pun sama juga dengan gerak langkah untuk lelaki. Hanya yang berlainan ialah apabila lelaki memajukan langkah pertama ke hadapan dengan kaki kanan, penari perempuan mundur dengan kaki kiri selangkah ke belakang. Hendaknya penari perempuan melakukan tarian ini dengan lemah lembut. Okay, so this was also trying to encourage the two genders to learn and also to perform without the Ronggeng girl. 1157. Okay, so this is in a nutshell the plethora of archives that I have to deal with to provide an understanding of Malay dance history pre-1965. Now, I would like to encourage friends who are interested to learn more about Malay dance, not what I've shared today, because that has yet to be, that is in a process to be a book. But for further resources to look at Malay dance, I would like, of course, to share that there is Arki-Tari, which is an online platform where you are able to look at Malay dance within a sociocultural setting, to understand its history and how it functions in relation to different other cultural practices. Of course, it's divided into different segments. There's interaction, anatomy, language, which Miss Liana was has contributed to, and evolution. Okay. Other than that, there is also a Ronggeng Revival Singapura online portal that you can go to, which is www.ronggeng revival. Early this year, my team of Arki-Gen members, some of them are present, were part of this focus group discussion where we encourage discussions within our community of practice, not only Malay dancers, but also musicians and adjacent arts, be it scholars or journalists, etc., to talk about the possibility of reviving Ronggeng today. Also at the same time, I'm quite shameless, but I have a show coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of December called Mekar Semarak, Celebrating the Nusantara, which is going to be at the Republic Cultural Centre. Will feature not only Malay dancers, but dancers of Sundanese, Javanese, and also tarian-tarian dari Sarawak, Kenyah, dan Iban. Friends from Malaysia will be present here. So I would like to encourage friends to come to watch. It's on the 2nd and 3rd of December. You can scan the QR code. other than that, we will be culminating the whole performance, with Rongging as well, to encourage an appreciation and hopefully for the revival of it. And with that, I would like to say terima kasih. These are some of my websites that you can go to. Of course, my own website, sotari.co, arkitari.com, ronggingrevive.com, and that's my email. And I hope, I hope it was a wonderful sharing with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Amin, for the very interesting presentation, which I was very amazed actually to see all those photos that you have encountered, during your research. And it's also interesting to see Malay dance from the point of view, the different perspectives that you have provided us. So from the colonial point of view and also the nation state. But I think what we have seen today is more of how the colonial saw Malay dance, right? And of course, it's synonymous or it's consistent with their general view of natives from this region, right? So privilege of the moderator, there are a few questions in the Q&A section in this webinar, but because it's moderator privilege, I would like to ask my first question first, put the floor with my first question to Dr. Amin, which is this. So you have shared how the colonial saw or how they saw and perceived Malay dance and how they represented it, right? So I understand that there was a section where you were talking about this misidentification of sounds, of vision, the identification of Malay dance and the instruments and stuff like that. It was a misidentification of it's actually Chinese instruments, but it was misrepresented as Malay dance, right? So I'm just thinking, I'm just curious, whether the colonial also saw the same derogative view or derogative view of the other Chinese or Indian performing arts in Singapore as nuisance as well, or how was it like? Maybe if you could share. Thank you.
Oh my God, Liana, that's a wonderful question. I'm very excited to be sharing even more about this. So to be honest, the colonials were not only treating Malay sounds and Malay dance in such a manner. Of course, prior to this, the colonials were already part of the Notch movement, the anti-Notch movement that was really happening in India, where the perception of temple dancers or devadasis was seen as wrong in their eyes, and they wanted to save the brown woman or save the Indian temple dancers from being subjected to what is regarded as prostitution in their eyes. So the Notch movement actually, to some extent, was extended also to our region because even if we didn't go through a very strict anti-Notch movement, there were times when Malay dance was regarded as Notch dance, right? The Joget Gamelan, for example, was written by, skips my mind, the name of the colonial researcher. He actually called it, a Notch dance because he saw the dancers that were part of the palace, the court dancers, were as Notch. And so in that sense, also there was a recognition that there were dance slaves or dancers who needed to be freed, who needed to be to not partake in such vices. So this was actually something very prominent already on how the colonials, and this is also their Victorian mentality where, they need to save the natives, from the heretics or basically seen as uncivilized, right? Yeah, so this was already in motion. Other than that, Chinese music wasn't very fully accepted, right? There were newspaper articles where there were complaints by residents who felt that Chinese music wasn't acceptable to the ears, that they were deafening, or they were basically music that should not be heard at all, because they don't like the high pitched sounds, etc. So a lot of times that it was also due to that it also added to the necessity for theatre ordinances at that time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Amin. That is definitely enlightening to see how it's not just Malay dance that was regarded as a nuisance or Malay art forms, but it's also generally the other groups as well, the other native communities as well in Singapore. Okay, now maybe we move on to the questions that we have here in the webinar. The first one is by Dr. Hanisa. Thanks, Dr. Hanisa, for your question. Maybe I could help read the question first. Pada pendapat doktor, apakah faktor-faktor yang akan membentuk atau mempengaruhi jenama, identiti atau jati diri tarian Melayu dalam landscape pembangunan Singapura? Okay, if I could translate it. In your opinion, Dr. Amin, what are the factors you think that shape or influence the branding or identity of Malay dance in the against the landscape of development in Singapore? Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's not a tough question, but it's a necessary question. Terima kasih, Dr. Nur Hanisa. Allow me to attempt this question. Now, I think nationalism in the Malay world has affected how we actually share very similar heritages, very similar forms, right? Even till today, we recognize that, because if we were to look at Muara, which is our yearly festival here in Singapore, if we were to look at some of the other festivals happening in Malaysia and also in Indonesia, there is recognition of shared heritage. Okay, but there's also an acknowledgement that each nation state within the Malay world has formed its own identification, right? Like, the identification is not only in the way we talk about our dance, but also in how we classify some of our own gestures today, right? Today, we can also acknowledge that different lenggangs could be attributed to different nation states. Now, kalau nak cakap pasal jenama atau identiti tarian Melayu di Singapura, I do feel that we are in a very privileged position where we are sandwiched between two very big identifying factories or identity factories. Like, this is my way of saying it quite casually, kan? In Malaysia and Indonesia, where they are where orang pribumi atau indigenous peoples are also people who are governing their own lands, they are capable of creating their own identity markers atau identities. Whereas in Singapore, because of the fact that there isn't a center, in a sense, we deal with a lot and we welcome a lot of ideas, right? Nak cakap pasal jati diri tarian Melayu tu bukan dalam, this is my thought, bukan dalam identifikasi satu pergerakan, tetapi kepada the spirit of creation, the spirit of innovation. A lot of times saya cakap yang tarian Melayu, inovasi is the DNA, right? But when I speak of this, of course some of my friends say, oh, awak ni pertikaikan inovasi saja, awak mempentingkan inovasi saja. Tapi bukan sedemikian. Sebenarnya, we are also trying to say that in acknowledging innovation, we also acknowledge the trails of our history to allow for innovation to occur. So, for me, jati diri tarian Melayu Singapura itu harus kita kenal dan peka akan sejarahnya, akan evolusinya. Dan dari situ, insyaAllah, in time to come, when there is more people who are willing to do the work of thinkers, to do the work of identity making, right? Hopefully that could be and can lead to something. But at this moment, I do feel that it is necessary that we acknowledge our sociocultural evolution, and also the innovation as DNA. Of course, this doesn't fit well with a lot of communities, because I think there is a worry that, if you're all about innovation, then where is the tradition? Well, that is in itself a very tough question, because we must also acknowledge the practice, right? What is being practiced today. There has been attempts, of course, by my seniors to find, atau dalam bahasa Indonesia, untuk mempakemkan tarian Melayu. Tapi kalau kita melihat tarian-tarian yang dipakem tu sendiri, itu adalah tarian-tarian bukan Singapura, tapi tarian-tarian yang datangnya dari Nusantara. So it is a very difficult question. Is complex, but I also feel the necessity for us to acknowledge the sociocultural history and its evolution. I think that's my take at this moment. Terima
Thank you,
kasih.
Dr. Amin. If I can rumuskan the important takeaways from Dr. Amin's answer is, I think, I mean, as a former, I would say former, because I am not practicing it for a while now, for 2 years now. But as a practitioner or former practitioner, I think what Dr. Amin is trying to say here is, when we talk about Malay dance in Singapore, it's more of the values that we want to semaikan dalam the practice itself, more than whether it's really Malay, or where is it coming from, the origins. Of course, that is important as well. We should know where the origins of certain types of dance, which is essential when we are learning and watching, for example, so we can recognize that, this is ronggeng, this is joget, this is tapi. That's important because we want to know the origins. But I think when we talk about modernity and development and progress of a cultural form, I think what's important is also the values that is embedded in the dance or art form itself. That's one. And number two, when we talk about I think the question about how do we identify Singapore's Malay dance, I think as a dancer as well, I'm not sure about other dance groups, but for me, when my teacher teaches me, okay, you have to know the basic dance first. What is the basic traditional 5 Malay moves or types first, before you can actually advance to what we call it contemporary Malay dance. So I was only as a dancer, I was only exposed to contemporary Malay dance when I was in JC. So before that, I thought, okay, Malay dance is only Zapin, Asli, Inang, and stuff like that. When I went to JC, and then I realized, Malay contemporary dance. Now, what is Malay contemporary dance? So Malay contemporary dance is a dance, if I may, Dr. Amin, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a slight break away from the 5 Malay dance forms. So in a way, we are more bebas in the langkah, but still at the same time, so it's a very challenging thing. It's a challenging genre, if I may, to choreograph, I feel, because I always feel, how do you choreograph a modern dance but at the same time traditional? So that's where I think I'm not sure where or when Malay contemporary dance started, but I think in Singapore, that's we see more of it here in Singapore. There's this balance between what is traditional and what is modern, right? The modern is not macam maknanya contemporary Malay dance tu dia it's guided by Malay traditional, and I think it's beautiful. So it's I think in that I see a value where there's a need to be to know your traditional cultural roots. At the same time, it's time to move forward and make your dance form a modern one, to see to balance that relevance in our world and context today. So I think that's what possibly some things I can rumuskan or summarize lah. And okay, maybe we have 15 more minutes. We have one more question here in the webinar Zoom, which I think it's aligned with my second question that I have in my notes here. Okay, so maybe if we have one more question. Okay, let's try the second question first. From here in the webinar, if I could read it. For both speakers, how do you think the younger generation can be informed about the history of Malay dance and play a part in maintaining or reviving it? And I think it's kind of similar to my question that I have here. Dr. Amin, why do you think it's important for Malay dance practitioners to acknowledge or know about the historical significance or historical evolution of Malay dance in Singapore, like what you have shared with us earlier? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Liana. I think when we think of Malay dance and the need or the desire for an authenticity, kalau kita fahamkan sejarahnya, kita tahu bahawa tarian Melayu itu sendiri adalah satu perkara yang hybrid. Okay, kalau kita melihat, for example, joget, ya, pergerakan joget itu datangnya dari tarian Portugis, Beranyo atau Beranle, dan dari situ kita memelayukan. Memelayukan ini adalah kalau if we were to look at it, how we don't there is no touching between men and women, there is acknowledgement of boundaries. Also at the same time, aesthetics which focus a lot on the hands, because a lot of maritime Southeast Asian movement, the movements of the hands, is very iconic and necessary. Okay, now kalau kita look at Zapin itself, right? Zapin came from the Arab Zafin, right? From the Hadramaut traders who came over, and some of them stayed and became made Nusantara their home, and they brought along this culture, which interestingly is no longer practiced in Hadramaut. That it has formed its own Malay form. There's an indigenization of Zapin, right? To acknowledge, more of the upper body than the lower body, right? So the importance of knowing all of this allows us the creative license to, number one, be sure of the form that we are doing, okay? And in that sense, also, for example, how can I read certain archives in the way that I could? Was because I know what Zapin is. I know what Inang is. I am aware of what Joget is. I understand the differences. And in acknowledging the differences, can I, able to look at past archives and recognize the form that is being practiced, okay? And also at the same time, it's also to acknowledge that there is an evolution, that culture is something that is not static, that it continues to evolve according to the times, according to the generation that is practicing it. But at the same time, for the generations afterwards that are taking on board the responsibility of bringing the dance forward, it is also the responsibility of said generation to ensure that they acknowledge all of their predecessors, all of what has happened before, so that they do not take for granted and allow for 1965 to be year zero.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Amin. So maybe we do our last question here that we have from Mr. Hafzal Aziz. Hi, Dr. Amin. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. He has a few questions here. Number one, how do you see Malay dance in Singapore in the present or maybe in the future? How do you see it moving? Right? And as a dance scholar, how do you negotiate or deal with the Malay dance practice in Singapore today?
Okay, thank you, Hafzal Aziz. This is actually my Sarawakian friend who will be coming to perform with us for Makar Semara, happening on the 2nd and 3rd December. Shameless promoting. Okay, so how do I see Malay dance in Singapore in the now or maybe in the future? I see Malay dance in Singapore still being a relevant practice for people who see its importance and relevance, who see the importance of the nilai-nilai yang ada di dalam tarian, yang boleh meneruskan atau boleh menjadi pedoman untuk generasi penerus, right? So there are nilai, like for example, the aesthetics of the form might change, okay, but the nilai-nilai dalam tarian itu, okay, continues to exist because practitioners, because people who are practicing it by yang this generation ke generation afterwards see the importance of it. And I do feel that if dia nilai-nilai murni yang masih boleh dipraktikkan, masih boleh diamalkan, sudah tentu nilai-nilai itu akan terus hidup, terus dipraktikkan, diamalkan, right? So for example, I don't think there is any harm in respecting our elders forever, till back and now, right? So these are nilai murni yang kalau diterapkan dalam tarian Melayu sudah tentu akan terus mekar atau terus wujud, right? And also at the same time, because Malay dance has elements that represent the real world, right? Like if we were to look at, like even for the Chinese culture, you have the yin and yang, the differences of the masculine and the feminine, right? If these elements are still important for a generation, they would definitely include the element of the masculine and the feminine to acknowledge that this is what makes the world, right? And also this is what allows for a better understanding of two different parts, right? Please do notice that I said masculine and feminine and not male and female, because in every movement, baik peranan lelaki atau peranan perempuan, sudah pasti ada elements of masculinity and elements of femininity, because it is part and parcel of our bodies, that we acknowledge that these are nuances of gerak. Okay? Now, yeah, I'm just going to stop there. Now, as a dance scholar, how do you negotiate or deal with the Malay dance practice in Singapore today? I see, to me personally, that of course, a particular generation would see it as, oh my God, it's so diluted. Oh my God, it's not how it used to be practiced. I mean, it's common. This kata-kata is common to say because we are very nostalgic creatures. As human beings, we always tend to idealize a particular period, right? Till today, we still see the dances in the films to be the pinnacle of Malay culture. And it's okay, for some people, that's wonderful. But if you were to do an analysis, right, of the bodies that were practicing then and the bodies that are practicing today, it's very different. Right? Kelembutan yang kita praktikkan hari ini atau kita terapkan kepada tarian-tarian Melayu atau penari-penari wanita sekarang sungguh berbeza dengan penari-penari yang ada di dalam filem. Okay? Tapi kita melihatnya sebagai, oh, itu adalah the pinnacle of Malay culture kerana sewaktu itu tarian Melayunya lebih simple, lebih tidak macam-macam, etc. And that's fair. We accept that, right? But we also must accept that for some people, that preference has evolved, right? And I personally believe that there is room for a diversity of varied preferences, varied expressions, okay? Because it also shows kebangkitan atau pembangunan, perkembangan pengamalan tersebut. So I do feel that I personally feel that there's nothing to worry about Malay dancing because it's being practiced. But what is the worry is the discourse of the form. We are hearing constantly about the aesthetics of the form, which is also valid and important. But the talk about it, the description, the ability to understand concepts, to talk about the body of work that choreographers have created. Tu yang kita kurang. Seperti mana kalau kita lihat kat teman-teman in literature, kesusastraan, they are able to look at a particular author's body of work and they are able to sift out the themes, right? And because books or literature is not ephemeral, tarian is ephemeral. So then how are we to document? How are we to make discourse about it? This is something that is of urgent need, that the community needs to realize today, 2022. Gitu. And to encourage more people like Liana, who was able to articulate, walaupun dia kata dia bukan seorang penari sekarang, tapi oleh kerana dia telah melalui proses menjadi seorang penari, beliau dapat bicara, dapat memahami the concept of evolution, the concept of talking about dance in a manner that is sophisticated and intellectual, macam gitu. But of course, we also accept the privilege that academia talk or jargon is also a privileged setting. But I think even in the most foundational setting of conversing about dance, this is something that we're lacking. Nah, gitu.
Thank you, Dr. Amin. That was a very, I think, compact lecture and also Q&A session where, of course, we can't learn everything and anything about Malay dance in Singapore, right, in just one session. So perhaps maybe this could be continued. Maybe there's a part 2 to this. I'm not sure. Fadli, MHF, maybe we can arrange something also to follow up with this, because it's definitely not enough. This 1.5 hours is not enough, and maybe in time we can look at how we can top up another topic, another following lecture or session on this topic of Malay dance, right? So thank you to everyone here who has joined us. Maybe I pass my time back to Fadli.
Thank you, Dr. Amin, for delivering an enlightening and energetic presentation, and Liana for moderating the Q&A segment today. All right, everyone, dear friends, we have now come to the end of the webinar. We hope you have found the session beneficial and also informative. The webinar today concludes the WWS this season. We sincerely appreciate your attention this morning. Before we do so, please allow me to share some administrative matters before we end. Okay, just give me a moment. Let me just share the slides here. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see the slides?
Yes, can.
Okay, can. Okay, so stay tuned to and follow our social media for any updates or MHF programs, especially for the next year, 2023. Okay, if you're interested to know any developments about the foundation itself, you may also subscribe to our newsletter. Okay, yeah, for contribution, if you wish, there's 2 QR codes. One is via giving.sg and the other one, I think, for other means of donations. Okay, right now, I think, okay, now I would like to invite everyone to scan the following QR code on screen, and please share your feedback with us. So I think with all the feedback collected, I think we will try and strive to improve our programs moving forward. And thank you so much for your support. I'll leave the screen for a while for everyone to scan. I've also shared this earlier in the comments section. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah, thank you so much. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next year. And please keep supporting the Malay Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much. Okay, with this, have a pleasant weekend, everyone. On behalf of Dr. Amin and Liana, signing off. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Have a pleasant weekend, everyone. Thank you.